Morning. We're so pleased that you could join us for our very first Zoom webinar program. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. In addition to the devastating pressure COVID-19 has put on healthcare systems around the world, it remains to be seen what the impact will be on our economies, as well as to what we refer to broadly as globalization. We're very fortunate today to have with us Sebastian Mallaby, an individual who has one of the sharpest minds to address these issues and much more. Now, before we get started, a few things. Please submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can also submit questions at any time, and you can upvote them. So if you'd like to have it answered by uploading it or upvoting it, just click the like button. We also ask that your questions are kept succinct and that the Q&A submission box be used only for questions. No conversations, no comments, because you know what will happen? I'll probably get confused. We appreciate your patience if there are any technical issues, and just let us know when we'll work on them. I want to take this moment too to especially thank the supporters of Interabang, Dallas's independent bookstore. You can order from them books by authors featured on our calls by going to interabankbooks.com. You know, they're probably the quickest way to get books now, because I noticed that Amazon has an extended wait period now. Our guest, Sebastian Mallaby, is the Paul A. Volcker Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also a contributing columnist for the Washington Post. His most recent book is The Man Who Knew the Life and Time of Alan Greenspan, certainly timely. And in 2016, it won the Financial Times McKinsey Best Book in 2016. Sebastian, it's great to have you with us today. Thanks so much. And I apologize that we got a late start to all of our listeners.
Good to be with you, Jim.
Sebastian, we all woke up this morning with quite a surprise that your Prime Minister and also the Health Secretary have succumbed to the virus. What's been the response to that throughout your country?
Well, I think there's a sense that it's going to be business as usual as much as possible. The nature of cabinet government in the UK means that you do have a sense of collective responsibility for decisions. Is not quite so, it is not presidential, unlike the US system. So I think that makes it a little easier to take. The other thing about the past 2 or 3 weeks here in the UK has been that every time the Prime Minister Boris Johnson appeared on TV, and for quite a while he was doing it every day, he would be flanked by the 2 top scientists in the government, the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Science Officer. And so there's been a sense from the beginning that this is a team effort. It's led by the scientists, by the experts. Ironically, during Brexit, Boris Johnson was saying, and his close colleague, Michael Gove, who is the sort of second most powerful politician in the cabinet, they were saying, this country's had enough of experts with respect to negative predictions about the economic impact of doing Brexit. But now that we have a pandemic, this country can't get enough of experts. There are experts on the news every day. And I think there's a sense that this is a team, the public health policies will go on, and it's, as long as the symptoms aren't too serious for the Prime Minister, it's not a significant problem.
We've seen in this country too that our leader, President Trump, of course, has not really followed social distancing, and we all worry that when he's standing there with scientists who are responsible for this, that they could all be self-quarantine at a later point. It's so important, I think, for our leaders to show an example. What?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, I was going to say there was a moment which Boris Johnson was criticized for when he was asked about Mother's Day, and he was asked, would he be going to visit his mother? And of course, his own government's guidance was that precisely you should not go face to face to see your aged mother when you're trying to self-quarantine, you should Skype or FaceTime or whatever. And he fluffed that one. It's a good thing that he did end up Skyping her in retrospect, now that he's tested positive.
So today, I assume and that the U.S. Congress will have a successful vote on this massive relief bill. I'm sure you've been following it extremely closely. Is it enough? And what do you think about the actual structure of it? Is it going to go into the right areas?
You know, I think the baseline for this action is what was learned after the 2008 crisis, when there was a fiscal response, but it took a little while to get it going, and it was widely deemed in retrospect to have been too small. This time you've got a much bigger response because that lessons have been absorbed, and there is an attempt to drive assistance, not just to banks and so forth, but to regular households. I haven't had time to digest all the detail, I'm afraid, Jim, but I get the sense that this is going to be, you know, a pretty broad-ranging effort to put spending power in the pockets of people who need it. I mean, one thing which I think is different in the US than the crisis response you see fiscally in Europe is that my understanding is that the US assistance is in the form of kind of cash if you lose work, rather than cash to keep your work. In some of the European responses, there's been more of an effort to structure the assistance so that companies that might have been letting workers go won't. They'll kind of freeze them in place so that when the virus goes, those relationships between employers and employees have not been disrupted.
I read about that's the model followed in Germany and France. Is that what's happening in the UK as well?
Yeah. So, for example, there's a promise that 80% of the salaries of workers who would otherwise be laid off would be covered by the government. You know, there's obviously a definitional challenge about how you ascertain which workers might have been laid off. But if companies can show that their profits have been, you know, their revenues have been squeezed to zero by this, which is of course true for a lot of companies, then they are eligible for this kind of assistance. And so if you are running a retail operation, for example, and you were unable to retain all the people working in your shops, you can now retain them because the government's going to pay their salaries for you.
And I gather that would make it, in a sense, easier, I presume, to reopen, to re-stimulate the economy, because you haven't lost employees who may be going to another place if they can find the job somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's a balance, right? In a normal kind of downturn, you might want workers in a company that's particularly affected to be laid off in order that they should then go get jobs in some other sector of the economy that is much less affected. But when you've got something like coronavirus, so many different sectors have been shut down essentially by a government decision to tell people to stay at home. That kind of normal argument in favor of frictional unemployment doesn't apply anymore.
I see that we have almost 200 participants, but we don't have any questions yet. So please do send me your questions as well. Tell us how this is different, the impact on the economy from, say, 2008, both the dramatic impact that it's having and how we come out of it.
Well, I think the short-term blow from coronavirus is going to be bigger than it was in the case of the 2008 financial shock. You're seeing that in the spike in the number of unemployment claims in the US, the incredible fall in industrial production, and in China in the first 2 months of this year. This is really an extreme sudden stop. And so I think, we're talking about collapses of GDP 10% or more year on year in the advanced economies in the second quarter of this year. So it's a very steep downward spike. But the good news is that if we get to a point in terms of the epidemiology and the public health advice where people can go back to work, then companies can resume business, and it won't be like 2008 in the good way. What I mean is that there won't be a debt overhang. One of the big problems in '08 was that the problem originated in the financial system because real estate prices had collapsed, and therefore real estate linked financial instruments had collapsed in value. And so people's assets were suddenly half of what they thought. And that meant that there were ongoing weaknesses in the balance sheet, which inhibited spending and investment by consumers and companies. In theory, in this case, if the government can backstop the private sector during the shock for, let's say, 3 months or 6 months, at the end of that, you go back to where you were, and there is no big debt on your balance sheet. And in fact, you might even have some companies which accelerate their sales because the folks who didn't go out and buy the iPhone during the shutdown, now there's all of a sudden a bunch of pent-up demand, and maybe the economy could accelerate out of the downturn. So you have a potential for a V-shaped recession and then recovery, very, very sharp on the downturn, hopefully fairly abrupt and steep on the upturn as well.
We can certainly hope for that. How has Brexit impacted the resources that the UK might have had access to, as well as, I might add, its overall handling of the pandemic?
Well, one particular controversy around the handling of the pandemic has to do with ventilators. The European Union went as a group to try to purchase additional ventilator machines, which, as you know, are a kind of key choke point in the response to this. Your death rate is significantly affected by the proportion of serious cases which can be treated. And to treat people, you need ventilators, and these are in short supply. So the European Union went off to buy some more, and the British government was not part of that joint procurement effort. And there was a response from London saying, oh, they lost the email which had invited them to take part in this procurement. And that's now today being rubbished by officials in Brussels. So that's one specific fight, kind of domestic argument in British politics around the UK's relationship with Europe. Arguably, if the UK had been on better, closer terms with its friends in Brussels, it would have been able to purchase some extra machines. But, I think going back to the other part of your question, which is whether Brexit has affected the ability of the UK to respond, I'm not sure it makes that much of a difference. And the reason is that although the economy is in less good shape than it would have been, and although therefore tax revenues are a bit lower and the ability of the government to spend might be slightly lower, that effect is swamped by the willingness of the government essentially to borrow. And so at least in the short term, there is almost unlimited resources that the government's willing to throw at pandemic response, because it's decided that in a world of extremely low interest rates, government debt is no longer such a worry. And Jim, I think this is a big question that we don't yet know the answer to, and I debate this with colleagues of mine at the Council of Foreign Relations. When we come out of this episode, will the idea that throwing budget resources without worrying about the national debt, is that something you can get away with? Or does that turn out to have a big sting in the tail economically? And if you think that the lesson from 2008 was that central banks could print enormous amounts of money to do quantitative easing, and yet the penalty that was predicted in terms of inflation never materialized. So too, it might be that in this case, governments can borrow extraordinary amounts of money, increase the national debt, but because the interest rates are low, the cost of servicing that debt remains low, and they get away with it. I'm sure that won't work in Argentina, right? Because in developing economies with weak reputations in financial markets, a government that borrows too much is going to be punished with inflation and a collapse in currency. But in the richer world, and certainly in the United States, which has the privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency in the form of the dollar, it might work to worry very little about the national debt, at least in a sort of 2 to 3 year horizon.
Well, let's move now to the role that the Federal Reserve has played. As we well remember, on March 15th, a Sunday no less, the Federal Reserve lowered the target rate for the federal funds rate to 0 to 0.25%. I mean, just really amazing. And then a few days later, it established a special commercial paper funding facility. What else is in its toolbox?
Well, as you've indicated, interest rates have already been cut to pretty much zero. And experience in places like Japan and the European currency area with the European Central Bank is that you can cut the policy rate below zero a tiny bit, but really not a meaningful amount, because if you cut too much, then you're basically saying to individuals that if they park their money in a bank account, they will pay the bank to look after their money. And if that penalty becomes too big, folks are just going to pull their money out and take cash and put it in their mattress. So you can't push the interest rate negative very far. Therefore, basically, classic monetary policy is exhausted. The second tool is quantitative easing, and we've seen a huge increase in that from the Fed in the last week or two. In fact, I looked up some numbers recently. The amount of quantitative easing that was going to be done in 1 week in March this year exceeds an entire 8-month program of quantitative easing in around 2010, 2011. So it's really a very significant quantity of money that's being created by the Fed. So again, there are diminishing marginal returns to that policy tool, so I don't think that can be used much more. So the last category of intervention from central banks is to take money, essentially, and don't just create it and let it filter through the system, but actually put it into the hands of people who need it. So I'm thinking about businesses that are under severe pressure because the corporate bond market is essentially closed. They cannot issue bonds, therefore they go to the bank, but the banks have limited capacity to create fresh loans. So the central bank, as the lender of last resort, needs specifically to target corporations, whether these are large or small, that are not getting access to borrowing when they need it. And you could do that, for example, by going to the commercial banks and saying, the central bank will provide money to you on condition that then this is passed through to the corporate sector. And then a similar kind of logic applies to households, where if you've got households which suddenly lose their source of revenue because the income earners are not able to go to work, they can't pay the mortgage, they need mortgage relief. And again, the central bank could be part of a strategy of channeling this targeted kind of relief to those who need it.
So overall, would you give the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank high marks?
I would, yes. I think he responded quickly and with overwhelming force. I don't think that the Federal Reserve is going to be the main game in the response, because I think that, as we've just seen, the Congress and the president are on the point of passing a very big fiscal stimulus. And that is a more direct way of getting money to people who need it. But I think the central bank can play a role, and all the signs are that Chairman Powell will do that.
Let me bring in a question from Danielle Milan. Can you speak about China's soft power in the world at this point, and what China can do moving forward to assist the world in fighting this disease? And before you reply, I saw this article this morning in the Washington Post by Karen DeYoung and others, talking about essentially where the United States is sort of stepping back. Elizabeth Braw of the London-based Royal United Services Institute said, "In international crises, America has always been the country to which other countries have turned for leadership and to steer the ship. And now, which country is looking to the United States? No one."
Yeah, I mean, China is in the ironic position of being the country where the virus started, of being the country where the initial response was secretive and slow and badly handled, to turning that around, managing apparently to turn the tide on the virus domestically to the point where for some time now in Wuhan, they've found almost no new cases. I'm not sure I believe that data, but still the broad point that the progress has been made domestically against the disease, that does seem to be true. And then by providing ventilators to Italy and making a few other sort of high-profile interventions, China has been able to appear as the sort of moral leader in fighting a pandemic which ironically grew out of China, and which maybe also has something to do with bad public health standards in animal markets in China, where these kinds of virus make the jump between animals and humans. So the question, I think, is whether this apparent soft power victory that China is winning, whether that could be, we're not through this thing by any means. And as China lifts restrictions on its citizens and tells them to go back to work, the danger of a second wave of infections must be pretty high. And how China manages that second wave, I think we don't know yet. And so we don't know whether China will end up looking like the soft power victor.
That's a good lead into this question that we have from Don Carroll. Have you seen a reasonable economic analysis of the cost benefit of shutting down most of the economy to reduce deaths, but postpone the point at which we have herd immunity, which is something, of course, that Boris Johnson talked about at the outset of the pandemic?
Yeah. There's a very short answer is I haven't seen a good cost benefit, but I think the reason is that it's almost impossible to do it. And the key thing you'd have to take a view on if you were trying to do that sort of study is, let's suppose that you turn the tide on the virus, as has been done in Wuhan, through very strict social isolation. And that takes you, let's say, 2 months. And at the end of 2 months or 2 to 3 months, you're able to slightly lift the lid off and let people go back to somewhat of a normal life. And then, then the question is, what happens after that? In one scenario, when you take the lid off, the virus comes back, the infections start, you don't have herd immunity. And so you end up with repeated waves of the virus. Each time you clamp down, the virus is beaten back, you lift the lid and it starts again. And at the end of this cycle of infection suppression, you haven't saved that many lives. In the end, most people have been infected. You end up with a herd immunity. It's just that it took you, 15 or 18 months not the 3 months it might have taken you if you had done nothing and just allowed the virus to sweep through your population. So that's one scenario. But the other is that you take the 3 months, you beat the virus back, and in the meantime, medical interventions are developed. Now, I'm not talking about a virus, which I think is not plausible on a 3-month time frame. That's more like a year to 18 months. But I am talking about ordering many more test kits. If you have more test kits, you can plausibly do contact tracing, where you isolate individuals and those they've come into contact with. And that's a different way of fighting back the virus. And so, in other words, it's worth doing this extreme isolation if you use that time to build up your medical arsenal. If you don't use that time to build up the medical arsenal, then it probably isn't worth it, to be honest. You're just delaying the disease toll and the death burden. You're not really ending it.
And it just underscores the need to, as quickly as possible, find a vaccine. Scott Davies asked, and so did many other people as they do this way to show higher priority to the questions. Do you think that certain industries will suffer to the point that they cannot recover? And if so, which industries are most likely to shrink and not recover? And you know, I'd add to that, you know, you look at some of the large restaurant chains and you can imagine that they'll be able to bounce back, but smaller restaurants owned by, you know, one proprietor, seems like it'll be very difficult for them.
Well, so thinking about it in terms of sectors, I mean, I think it's plausible to talk about some changes in consumer behavior that will turn out to be permanent. We're doing this discussion through Zoom. I expect that Zoom will be permanently more popular in the future than it would have been otherwise, because this is a crash course for all of us. We're all learning how to use Zoom. And now that we figured it out, maybe we're going to fly less to conferences a little bit, and we won't use alternative means of that we might have used to get together. So Zoom is one example. You know, I think that sort of telemedicine is going to be used a lot in this crisis. People don't want to go to the hospital, or in fact, in the UK where I am, you're not allowed to go to your local doctor's office anymore, because that would be to bring the infection in and risk the health of the doctors that you need. So you communicate with the doctor on the telephone. And I think there'll be, that could also be a secular, sort of permanent, durable shift. So there are a few things like that that one can think of where behavior might be permanently changed. But I don't think it really is so radical as to lead me to foresee any actual sector to close down. There will still be people who want to go and stay in a hotel, get on an airplane. All that stuff is going to come back, you know, public health conditions allowing.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, one last part of your question was whether the, you know, there would be individual proprietors of small family restaurants. And I think, yes, that depends on the government support. If those people lose their businesses because they suddenly have no revenue and the government does nothing to help them, then I could imagine that those individuals would be so financially beaten back that they wouldn't be able to recover. But as you say, the bigger companies with deeper pockets are just going to come back because, you know, they will have access to finance, and it will make sense to bring them back because the basic demand for what they were providing is going to come back to normal.
Neil Jacobs asks, should we be worried? Are you worried about a change in how the world views the US dollar in terms of being the world's reserve currency?
No, I don't think so. I think the US dollar is like the English language. It's, you know, very hard to unseat the incumbent leader because of network effects. The more people who use the English language, the more it's the natural language for kids in China to learn, or kids anywhere else. And so it is with the dollar. Dollars are used for transactions within countries where the money never passes through the United States, but that's the convenient sort of lingua franca of global finance. So I don't think that's changing.
We have a number of questions along this lines. What can the average person do now to prepare for the likely economic fallout recession that may be on the horizon? I would say that it is on the horizon. Any advice specifically for young adults who have not yet faced such economic turmoil?
Well, I think that to the extent that young adults can use the time to acquire skills, which is something that you can teach yourself in some cases, that's great. If that's, that obviously depends slightly on the nature of the young adults' pursuits. I have 3 adult children. 2 of them, I would say, because they are in postgraduate or undergraduate education, can basically carry on doing their work and their research. And, the astrophysicist just needs some data on her computer and she's happy. But then I have another adult child who is a cameraman and involves going out and filming in the street. And that's a harder proposition when there's a lockdown. And so it's tougher for him. So it does obviously vary person to person. But I think, if people can stay healthy by continuing to exercise, stay mentally healthy, stay in touch with friends via electronic methods, this could actually be a useful life lesson in resilience and in reminding yourself that, life goes on. So I think it's not all bad for those young people who aren't actually likely to get terribly sick, even if they catch the virus. It may be unpleasant, but the fatality rate is very, very low. It's more of a mental challenge. There was a case I was reading about in the UK newspapers today of a young woman, I think aged 19 or so, who committed suicide because she found the isolation too tough to take. That's the kind of thing I'm worried about. It's the mental side. And I think, staying fit and staying optimistic and staying connected to friends is really what you're going to do.
Now, we have a few questions along those lines. If social distancing becomes even stricter than it is now and possibly extends a year or 18 months, how will that change the way we interact with each other?
Boy, that's a really hard one. I think, families and family relationships are going to be tested. My own sort of intuitive sense of friendships outside my family is that actually some of this was maintained online anyway and through phone calls and so on. And, in fact, this virus, Jim, has brought us together. Here we are together having a good conversation. And it's true that last time we had a good conversation, we might have been on bikes together in Dallas. But we can maintain a good touch. I think it's for families where the experience, the habit, the expectation is for much closer face-to-face contact. That's where life is changing and people are making choices. And I have, in the older generation in my family, one aunt who is living entirely by herself, aged about 80. And that's very tough. And you might say, well, use Zoom or FaceTime and talk to your grandchildren. But if you're 80, sometimes you have trouble making that computer function. And so she's chosen to go for the medical safety, being by herself. There are other people who are of the same age who have moved in with their kids. It's a little bit more risky, but it's emotionally more stable. And people are going to come to terms with these trade-offs in a way that they didn't have to before.
Yesterday, I was out briefly doing a essential errand, and noticed how many cars there were parked in our neighborhood and was wondering why. And then I came to the realization it was because there were so many students and children, young adults that were back home. For a moment of levity, I'll have to tell our listeners that you and I were talking a few years ago, and you had brought your bike gear, and because you were all excited about going to San Francisco, and I said, well, what about Dallas? And you looked at me sort of aghast, bicycling in Dallas? And so I found a bike for you, and we had a grand time going around our beautiful lake.
It was terrific.
So let me ask you this question from Thomas Kennelly. Will the U.S. stimulus package fundamentally change the relationship between the U.S. government and the private sector, making it more similar to what we do see in Europe?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think this might be in the category of things where behavior and attitudes do get changed in a durable fashion. I think it's fair to say that through history, as crises have faced the United States, the federal government has responded to those. I'm thinking mostly of world wars, and in the process have increased their share of GDP, and that's not been rolled back afterwards. And so the Second World War was clearly, well, the combination of the Depression and the Second World War were clearly a step change in the size of government in the US. And I think it might be the case that some of what happens over the next months does lead to an increase in the share of government in GDP. I don't think, if that's done cleverly, strategically, it doesn't have to be bad. I mean, just to take an example, which I think most of us would have no trouble agreeing with, this does show that federally backed public health is pretty important. We have the CDC. Maybe the CDC needs to get a bit bigger. Maybe its test kits would have been better if it had, I don't know what went wrong there, but so there are kind of federal functions that might need to be strengthened as a result of this, just like after 9/11, Homeland Security was beefed up. I don't think it needs to sort of spread into saying that the government is going to, direct the airlines or something. And I think that to the extent that the government moves into that kind of field, one hopes that it will retreat afterwards.
Right. We've talked a little bit about China, but Carl Pankratz asked a question that I think does deserve some more elaboration. How will this affect, if at all, the Belt and Road Initiative, and again, China's place in the global community? Will we see them take a much stronger leadership role as the United States seems to be withdrawing?
I think, I think that's been going on, for a while, and particularly since President Trump was elected. The first Davos meeting of the Trump presidency was the one where Xi Jinping, went to Davos and basically tried to claim the mantle of the leader of globalization, now that there was an anti-globalization president in the White House. So that's been happening anyway. I think the Belt and Road Initiative is partly a function of, whether China has excess savings. If it's running a huge current account surplus, generating a large savings surplus, it's going to plow that money out into the world. And one way of doing that was to provide official lending to countries where that might buy strategic influence, whether that was, investing in Greek ports to get some leverage over Greece, or stepping in right now to Italy and saying, would you like some ventilators? So I think the Chinese are opportunistic about this because their current account surplus actually has come down a lot in the last 5 or 6 years. I think actually Belt and Road is going to be smaller, not bigger. But I think, you know, China, one of the things that China wants to do is not the top priority. The top priority for the government, I think, is to stay in power, to keep the growth rate at a point where its legitimacy is not undermined, manage problems like Hong Kong, and the split between the sort of Cantonese-speaking domestic population, which is pretty hostile to what they see as the carpetbaggers from mainland China. That there are a bunch of these issues which I think matter the most to the Chinese regime. But, you know, accumulating external soft power is another objective, feeds into the nationalism. And so I don't think coronavirus massively changes the trajectory there, but there is an underlying trend towards China trying to build up its prestige in the world.
Maybe we can learn from some of the acts that China has taken, and also to see how they're coming out of this. Teresa Flores asked, do you know if there are any sectors, specific sectors, that have closed down in China, and I might add as well in South Korea, or Sebastian, is it just too early to tell?
You mean specific industrial sectors?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think they followed a similar pattern to what we've seen in Europe and what we're going to see in the US, which is to say, when they realized that the virus was spreading very, very quickly, they just pretty much closed everything down other than stuff that was viewed as essential, like food delivery and medical services. Now that they are going back to work, I think they're trying to open up everything. The targeting is not done according to which sector of the economy they're trying to close. Rather, the targeting is around individuals who test positive for the virus. And what there is in East Asia, which I think the West needs to consider emulating, is this very sophisticated way of tracing people, which has issues for civil liberties, but in an emergency, I think are worth considering. So for example, I'm told that when you go on a subway in Seoul, South Korea, you scan the reader, your phone scans the reader as you walk into the particular subway carriage. So they know which carriage you were in at what time, and they know the names of everybody else who was in the carriage with you. Sorry, Jim, let me see if I can get rid of that. That's my sister-in-law, proving that we're still connected, you see.
You should be listening to our call.
But the point I was going to make about South Korea is that if you then test positive for the virus, the government can trace who was in the subway carriage with you 6 days ago and contact those particular individuals who were exposed to you, have them tested, and if they test positive, trace who those people were in touch with. So I think, the use of tracking technology on people's phones can be put to a good purpose of selectively finding people who may be spreading the virus, which to me is preferable to making the whole nation self-isolate.
Right, but in this country, we can't even agree on an identity card. So I think that's
I agree.
pretty much a pipe dream.
I agree. I recognize that.
So Michael asked an interesting question, and it's one that I'm sure you've given a lot of thought of, because I know you're doing a lot of work right now on China. And so Michael says, China is reporting that 9 weeks into their pandemic, conditions are markedly improving, both health-wise and economically. What do you think, Sebastian, about the statistics and information we're getting from China? And has any group in the UK done an independent analysis to verify these reports?
Well, Jim, the first thing to be said is that all the data on the number of cases in all countries are extremely suspect, because it's a function of how many people you test. And we all know that only a fraction of the people who get sick ever are tested. So we have no idea what the real numbers are, really. the way that estimates are generated is to look not at the infection rate, but the death rate. And then you take the death rate and you back out, if you reckon that the death rate is around 1%, which is an estimate, ballpark estimate that people use, you take the death rate, you multiply by 100, and you get a guess of how many people were sick at any given time. So this is pretty rough stuff. I think that China's statistics, however, are even less credible than everybody else's. I say that because, they were not honest about what they were finding at the beginning of the pandemic. And they are used to manipulating information and frankly, not telling the truth. I mean, the government's interests are more important in China, at least to the Chinese regime, than the truth is. And so I think the following scenario can't be ruled out, which is that in January and February of this year, industrial production and the economy collapsed with such incredible sharpness that the Chinese government felt they really had to get people back to work. So they clamped down on this thing, they got it under control, and now they're desperate for people to go back and work and generate some economic activity. But the way to get them to be confident enough to go back to work is to say there aren't any new cases. Really? No new cases? I mean, if you told me that it was much lower than before, I might believe you. But zero? I'm having trouble believing that. So I suspect that we're not getting the full story out of China. I believe that they have made progress, that they've beaten back the tide. That's good. They deserve some credit, but not as much credit as they are claiming.
Beth Huddleston asked this question to summarize. In the primaries in the United States for president, we've been seeing the major discussion point has been on healthcare. Do you think that what we're going through now may sort of move us towards of an acceptance of these, in quotes, socialistic trends?
Yeah, I don't know. My feeling is that the US is a bit like what you said about identity cards. The US is politically a very long way from accepting, the idea of single-payer healthcare. I think if Bernie Sanders had won the Democratic nomination and run on that ticket, he would have lost. I just don't think the US is there. Now, my personal view is that actually it should be there. I prefer having lived in the US for 18 years and naturalized as an American. Now that I'm back in the UK, I would say that the National Health Service is preferable because you get treated by doctors who do not have a profit motive to give you more care than you really need. And on serious things like cancer, public health systems, at least in this country, are very good at dealing with them. And I had a personal experience in my family recently where I wanted to research the kind of treatment my family member would get for a particular cancer. And I looked at the MD Anderson website and the Mayo Clinic and all the top US places. And I compared that to the government health service in Britain, and it's the same. So I think on serious stuff, the UK National Health Service is terrific. It doesn't provide easy access to less serious care, but I think it has a lot of attractions as a system. But I don't think that's where the United States is.
We have time just for one or two more questions, and this comes from Marco Delaria. To that point, could this work? The government has stopped the economy. The Federal Reserve has an unlimited balance sheet. Rather than haggling over the size of the relief, empower the Fed to print money to stabilize lost jobs. Once the pandemic ends, forgive the debt. Would that work?
Well, I mean, you have almost a version of that happening anyway, which is to say the Fed is doing enormous quantitative easing. That means the Fed is going off and buying a lot of government debt. The government debt, in turn, is financing things like this big stimulus. So basically, the Fed is creating money that's flowing through to the federal government, which is using that money to spend on the stimulus. So we're kind of pretty much there. The last piece is, could you just cancel that debt at the end? Well, you know, whether the US Treasury owes money to the Fed when they're both bits of the government sort of comes out in the wash. I don't think it makes a big difference, actually, whether you formally cancel the debt. The constraint on that strategy traditionally is if you just print lots and lots of money and pump it out into the system, you'll have too much money tracing too few goods, which means you'll get inflation. But in the last 10 years, the great mystery in the global economy is there hasn't been inflation despite enormous quantities of money creation. And so long as that inflation penalty doesn't materialize, it does appear to me that governments can go a long way in doing what looks like economic alchemy, Jim, you know, creating money out of thin air. It sounds crazy, but it appears to be working.
I have time for one more question, and it comes from Lee Jackson. If we knew that every 5 to 10 years in the future, there's likely to be a new highly contagious viral eruption such as what we're seeing now, what should governments do differently in emergency and economic preparedness to not be inventing an ad hoc response? Is there a greater role, or is there a role for multinational institutions to negotiate a set of voluntary preset protocols that might be followed at times like this?
You know, personally, I think you know, multinational institutions are useful. I wrote a book about the World Bank. I've spent some of my journalistic career, you know, advocating in favor of multilateralism. But I do think that national governments are really the main players in the world, and that's the level where I would hope to see lessons being learned. Especially, it seems to me, you know, if you think about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, you know, created in the wake, I think, of the oil shocks of the 70s. This, I might be wrong about when they were created, but whether I thought that's right, my point still stands, which is that there is a vulnerability to the nation from a sudden oil spike. So we have a strategic reserve. And what we need for viral threats is a strategic reserve of protective equipment for hospital workers and doctors, so that they don't have to wear the same face mask for hours on end. They can switch them out quickly, as you're supposed to. They have protective gloves. That's the basic minimum. You want an ability to generate a lot of test kits for the new pathogen very quickly. You want standby quantities of ventilators, which turn out to be life-saving and quite hard to procure rapidly when you need them. So I think, you know, we need to think in terms of a reserve, a stockpile of the kind of medical equipment that we need. And then maybe, you know, to the extent that this can be squared with those civil liberties, some way of doing contact tracing, because that is what made a difference in South Korea. And that is now the Chinese strategy. And it is, you know, if you don't want everybody to be socially isolated, then the alternative is to isolate selected individuals strategically. I think societies may come around to the idea that to isolate a small number of people is better than isolating everybody.
And especially, I guess you're beginning to see a hint of that with what President Trump is proposing, this county by county analysis.
Right, exactly.
Sebastian, thanks so much for joining us. I know
Thank you,
the demands on your time, and we've really appreciated it. And as you mentioned, we both love to cycle, and I'm counting on you being back in Dallas, or even better, I'll be in London.
Okay,
And
terrific.
let me just remind everybody, you have time now to read Sebastian's book. It came out, as I mentioned, a few years ago, and it was recognized by the Financial Times and McKinsey as the top book in 2016, The Man Who Knew the Life and Times of Alan Greenspan. And you can get that book at interabankbooks.com, and they'll send it out to you probably today.
Jim, I'm just zooming in on my my stationary bike there, just so that you see that I'm keeping in shape.
Oh, all right, great. And you're inside as well, social distancing. So let me remind everybody too, if you are not yet a member of the World Affairs Council, we're offering a 20% discount on new memberships through April 30th. And just go to our website at dfwworld.org/passport, or you can even give our staff a call. All the phones, again, showing how we can adapt. You can call an office number and it'll be forwarded to the staff member at their home. These are certainly challenging times, and we hope that all of you stay well. We are dedicated to bringing you quality programming. And let me just highlight that next week, I'll be speaking with George Friedman, the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures. And he has a new book, The Storm Before the Calm. Imagine that title. The Storm Before the Calm, America's Discord, the Coming Crisis of the 2020s, and the Triumph Beyond. And then on Friday, April 3rd at 11 a.m., I'm going to be talking with Dione Searcy. I read her book last weekend. It's called In Pursuit of Disobedient Women. She's with the New York Times, and she talks about her years of working for the paper in Senegal, a lot about Boko Haram, but also what it's like being an international journalist. So again, thanks so much, all of you, for joining us. We had a large number, and let's go read for the rest of the day. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.